So yeah, so there are a few students who have, a bit of knowledge or must have studied constitutional law during their semester. I think in the third year, if I'm not wrong. And I feel a bit, you know, nervous because talking about constitutional law in presence of Shilpi ma'am specifically, while she was the one who taught me or taught our class, I would say constitutional law, and now in the presence of her, I feel a bit nervous, but still, I'll go ahead. So talking about the provisions of equality. So our Indian constitution says that constitution was and the constitution. So in a way, we can say that it was us, the citizens of India, who at the time of freedom, who at the time of getting independence, gave this constitution to ourselves. So many a times you must have read somewhere or heard somebody talking about that Indian constitution is a living organic document and is the most important law of the country, law of the land, the highest law of the land we can say. So nothing which violates the constitutional law should be upheld. So from where do we get this sense of notion about the constitutional law? Because the way to say is that constitutional law is not a creation out of any legislative power. Nobody or no external or uh, other document gave us the power to create constitution of India. It was then we, the people of India, who decided to formulate the Constituent Assembly in the first place, and then through negotiation and years of hard work and discussion, Constituent Assembly discussions. If you get to read about specific part of the Constitution or the whole of the Constitution, then it was we, the people of India, who borrowed different provisions of constitutional law from the different countries which were existing at that time when we got our independence. So before actually learning about what are the fundamental rights or what is your right to equality, it is very essential to have a bit of understanding as to how this constitution was created in the first place and how did we even end up getting these laws, or I would say fundamental rights, in the first place. So as I have said, Constituent Assembly was the most important aspect of framing of the Constitution, and throughout, the debates and everything, we gave this Constitution to ourselves. And if you must know, or if you have read that specifically Part 3 of the Constitution or the Fundamental Rights chapter, we have taken from the U.S. Constitution, the U.S. amendments. So fundamental rights, even though starts with Article 12, but your substantive rights only begin at Article 14. So you must be wondering that if Article 12 and Article 13 do not constitute the substantive part of your fundamental rights, then why they are there in the first place? What was required and why, or what is the necessity to even have Article 12 or 13 in the Constitution Part 3? So if you read the verbatim portion of what Article 14 provides, Article 14 in essence says that the state shall not deny any person equality before law or equal protection of the laws within the territory of India. Now, even though this article is such a small statement or very narrowly described, the application or the scope of this particular article goes way beyond. It is much wider than what it seems in a just short sentence. And you must learn the meaning or the interpretations of the words associated in this article. So to begin with, it provides that the word state. Now, what is the meaning of the state? In terms of, layman's language, a state is a territorial boundary. But in the meaning or in the spirit of constitutional law, a state is not just limited to a boundary, but it is a sense of responsibility that a body has. So with reference to constitutional law, whenever we use the word state, it implies that the definition which is accorded under Article 12. So your Part 3, the fundamental rights, begins with Part 3 of the Constitution under Article 12. So if you refer to Article 12, it basically gives you the definition of a state body. So as I read Part 3, Article 12, it says that in this part, unless the context otherwise requires, the state includes the government and the Parliament of India, the government and the legislature of each the states, and the local and other authorities within the territory of India or under the control of the government of India. Now, you must understand that why Article 12 and Article 13 are preceded over Article 12, because to understand the scope of Article 12, you must be thorough, or for that matter, to even understand the scope of your rights to equality, which goes from Article 14 until Article 18. So 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18 are the articles that give you right to equality. Specifically, Article 12, why is it important? Because Article 14 starts with the definition of the state. So here, the few terms are very clear that, Article 12 talks about the government and the legislature of each state, the government in the parliament of the country. But except these two clear identification, there are other terms which are also included under Article 12, which talks about the local authorities and other authorities. So now, even from the perspective of local authorities, certain clarifications are there, certain rational meanings are there, that whatever your Gram Panchayat or municipal corporation bodies are there, those for the meaning of Article 12 will be treated as a local authority. So in whichever state you are residing, so let's say we are talking about the state of Gujarat. So the local authorities of the state of Gujarat, let's say talking about the municipal corporations of each city. So here Surat Municipal Corporation and then Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation, something like that will be treated as a local authority. Now, the most important and the controversial or the complicated aspect of Article 12 is the definition of other authorities, because no meaning is attached to the meaning of actually what other authorities are. So, can anybody, even if like a little knowledge you might have, or, with some sort of ambiguity, can somebody tell me what all constitutes, or how do you determine that a particular body is other authority or not? You can raise your hand and I'll call out the name. Let's have, this a discussion rather than just a monologue, because understanding this concept is very essential, because I feel your fundamental rights are only enforceable against a state body, not against the actions of a private individual or a private corporation for that matter. So while enforcing your fundamental rights, you can only avail your right to equality against a state body. So for the first step in defining whether or not you have your case against violation of your right to equality is not to check whether or not the body against which you are trying to exercise your fundamental rights is a state body or not. So this is not something we are just, reading out the provisions of the Constitution or trying to interpret what are the words under Article 12, but there is a relationship between Article 12, 13, and the rest of your fundamental rights. So which is why it is very much essential to connect the dots and make a case for the violation of any of your fundamental rights. Even though we are specifically talking about right to equality, but all your fundamental rights and their operation and their justiciability goes in the same manner. It can be availed only against the state body. I mean, there are also certain fundamental rights which you can also enforce against, private bodies or private persons. So let's say when we talk about discrimination. So even if there is a discrimination by an action of a private citizen, then also you can actually avail your right against those bodies. But majority of, not I would say not all, but majority of your fundamental rights are only justiciable against the state body. All right, so coming back to, the discussion of the meaning of state and other authorities. So I would seek some volunteers who can ponder upon the definition or the interpretation of what constitutes as an other authority. I would really appreciate if you all can, just come up and speak. Uh, I see Sagar. Yes, Sagar.
Ma'am, various tests have been laid down by the Honorable Supreme Court in order to determine what other authorities are. So, one of the fundamental tests was laid down in R.D. Shetty versus International Airport Authority, in which the court held that there are certain grounds. Number one is the share capital must be owned by the state and it should enjoy monopoly status, or a department of government is transferred to the corporation. One is whether there is a state control, deep or pervasive state control, and last is what is the object of that authority. So this is one of the landmark judgments in this context.
Absolutely. Bang on. Wheel, do you want to add on to what Sagar said?
No, he has properly explained it.
Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
He has properly explained it already, point wise.
Okay, okay. So yes, Sagar has already explained scope or the extent of the definition under other authorities. So R.D. Sharma is essentially one of the most important cases from the perspective of Article 12. So what happened in that case was that the airport authority actually called out for the tenders to run some sort of hoteliers, and there were certain terms and conditions of the tender. So one of the most essential condition was that the prescribed form where the tenders were invited, it suggested that the registered second class hoteliers having at least 5 years of experience for putting up and running a second class restaurant, and 2 snack bars at the Bombay Airport Authority for a period of 3 years. Now, there was a certain aspect to the tender under which paragraph 8 stated that the acceptance of the tender would rest with the airport director, who does not bind himself to accept any tender and reserves himself the right to reject all or any of the tenders without assigning any reasons whatsoever. So now there were in total in total 6 tenders were received, and the fourth tender was the complete one, fulfilling all the conditions of the tender. So he was accepted, and he was given the tender. And all the other tenders were, rejected because they were incomplete. Now, the fourth respondent did not satisfy the condition of having registered second class hoteliers and having 5 years of work experience. So now, can you tell me that if all the conditions are not fulfilled, and if the respondent here who was accepted or who was offered the tender but did not comply with the minimum requirement of having at least 5 years of experience, and despite that fact he was accorded with the tender merely on the basis that he completed the prescribed form and his tender was complete. And even if the rejected tenders, despite having the prescribed minimum work experience, they were rejected. So how fair is it? How equal this treatment is, in your opinion? Anybody would want to give their opinion? Can I accept, because I have the authority to do so, despite the fact that the person has not completed the minimum requirements to be eligible to be accepted as the tenderer? Can I do so and reject all those candidates who fulfill the criteria, but their formalities are not complete? The forms are not complete. How equal do you think it is? Or how unequal, in your opinion, the facts are? Anyone? Do you feel any violation of Article 14 here? All right, so let me go ahead and let you know what was held in this case. So, of course, first of all, the question came up before the Supreme Court to decide whether or not the Bombay International Airport Authority can be called even a state body or not within the meaning of, Article 12. So a lot of perspectives were taken into consideration. So the court said that the International Airport Authority Act of 1971 empowers the central government to constitute the authority called International Airport Authority. And the features of this act were that authority, which is a body having a perpetual succession and a common seal, it consists of a chairman and other members who are appointed by the central government. Again, the central government has the power to terminate the appointment or remove a member from the board. And the authority does not have any capital of its own. And any capital required by the authority, it is wholly provided by the central government. And non-reoccurring airport. In the light of the salient features and the functioning of the airport authority, do you feel that it should constitute a state body? Can the airport authority be treated as a state body in the first place? If yes, only then the question needs to be decided on the merits of the case, whether or not there was even a violation of the fundamental rights. Because if the answer to the question whether airport authority constitute as a state body or not is negative, then there are no further questions which can be raised for the violation of your fundamental rights. It is only when a particular body in question in court of law or in the light of the circumstances or facts of the case which constitutes a state body, then only you can avail your fundamental rights against those bodies. So here clearly a lot of interference or participation, I would say, or the a governance power was accorded to the central government in a way, funding of the capital or appointment or removal of the board members or deciding about the expenditure. And on the top of that, it was a statutory body that was created out of the International Airport Authority Act. So given all the features of this particular body and the nature of its function, it was held that yes, airport authority would constitute as a state body under Article 12. It fulfills and satisfies all the required aspects of Article 12. And for that, not treating all the tenderers equally will be a violation of the fundamental rights of those who were rejected. Because despite they fulfilled the condition of having 5 years of work experience in the second-class hotelier, their tenders were not accepted. On the contrary, the tender of the accepted party who did not comply with the conditions of the tender was accepted. So this, on the face of it, is yes, indeed, violation of Article 14, and it should not be accepted. Are you able to connect with the topic? Where are we leading? Why it is important to understand what constitutes a state body? Yes, no. If you have any questions, you can post it in the chat box. I'll be more than happy to address any questions that you might have, because to go into the details of fundamental rights, I have been saying this again and again. I feel it is very much important to understand the other provisions, and that's the beauty of the constitutional law. I have always felt that no particular provision or no particular article is read in isolation. It is always affected affected by or read in connection with other parts of the constitution or other definitions or the interpretations of the constitution. It's never in isolation. Even while we talk about article 14 or part 3 of the constitution as a whole, or other parts of the constitution, they are always affected and connected to the other parts of the constitution at the same time. Even when we talk about basic structure of the constitution, and even while we talk about your fundamental rights, they are, even if you have your fundamental rights, they are not absolute in their nature. There is always a reasonable restriction put on them. So the thin line for you to decide is that where this reasonable restriction becomes unreasonable or arbitrary. And that's where your interpretation comes into being. If there is the question of violation of right to equality and you are the lawyer of the other side, so what is your task at hand? You will not directly jump at arguing on the merits of the case and saying that there is no violation of equality, there is no violation of substantial rights. Your first task at hand will be to decide and convince the court that the organization or the body against which the claims are made is not a state body in the first place. And if you are successful in proving that aspect, then the court will automatically waive the violation of fundamental rights, because it's not upon the bodies except for the state bodies to determine that your rights are not violated. It is the only obligation on those bodies who constitute as a state body to ensure that your rights are not violated. I know another interesting question for you. Do you think that you can make a claim against Oro University for violation of your fundamental rights? Are universities, and Oro University being specifically a private university, can we make any claim against universities or private universities per se for the violation of fundamental rights? Sagar says yes. Sagar, would you want to elaborate upon your answer? Give rationale. And constitutional law is always about rationale, no matter your answer is right or wrong. But if it does not, follow with your rationale, or what is the reason, or what is the nexus with the interpretation you are trying to make in the court of law, it does not really matter. And the answers not matter really, that even if you say no and the answer is yes, but if you are able to give proper reasoning behind it, a proper interpretation of why do you think otherwise, it's all that matters. There are no right and wrong answers in constitutional law, no straitjacket formula whatsoever for the applicability of your fundamental rights. All that matters is your interpretation. Because again, coming back to the point that constitution is a living organic document. What do we mean by Sagar, I'll come back to you in just a moment. Please bear with me. What do we mean by a living organic document? It means that it is ever evolving according to the changing needs of the society. Now, the circumstances, be it political, social, economic manner, those existed at the time of independence might not be the same in today's time, and they might not definitely be the same in the coming future times. So the real spirit of the constitution is to change according to the changing times of the society, changing needs of the society, and which is why it is the interpretation that matters the most in the light of current social, economic, and political scenarios, circumstances. And which is why, even though we have the lengthiest constitution in the world, written lengthiest constitution in the world, despite that, we have the amending to the constitution feature under Article 368 that talks about amendment of the constitution, the procedure of the amendment, the power of the parliament to amend the constitution. Why did we even need to have amending power when we already had written down everything we needed? Why did we have Article 368 in the first place? Because we wanted to keep our constitution as flexible as it can be, as long as it is consistent with our fundamental rights. So usually if you read much about constitutionalism and constitutional law, generally those constitutions which are written, are tend to be a bit of rigid constitution. But our constitution, we try to keep it a flexible one. We try to keep it not a rigid per se constitution. Even though, we have the federal feature of the constitution, it is more biased towards a unitary constitution. Now, federalism and unitary is something absolutely different on the track. So let's get back on the track and continue with whether or not even private universities fall under the purview of other authorities under Article 12 or not. Sagar, over to you.
So yes, private university, or let's say any other university, is well within the meaning of other authorities in the Article 12, because and there are various precedents on this too. The court has held that university is undertaking an important public function of imparting education at higher level, and that is nothing but a function of a public function at large. So hence it is a state, and any violation of any of the fundamental rights by the university can well be within the violation of uh, part 3 of the constitution.
All right. Do you have any case to support your argument?
Ma'am, I do not remember exactly the name, but a Punjab University's case law is there, which was taught.
Okay, all right. So, yes, to an extent, your rationale is absolutely right. So, before going into the discussion whether or not a private university even constitutes as a state body or not, while we actually determine a particular organization being the state body, the first and essential criteria is whether it discharges public function or not. So here, when we talk about university, what is the essential function that a university discharges?
Imparting education.
Education, yes. Can education be called a public function or is it a private function?
It can be called a public function. It is actually a public
Yes,
function.
it is actually a public function. It can't be just called, but it is a public function. Now, the question comes to decide whether or not the bodies who privately impart education or who are privately engaged in operating in the public sphere can be taken under the purview of other authorities or not. Because the essential criteria or the most important criteria to decide other authorities is to see what type of function does it discharge. If it is not directly connected to any of the government, be it of the central or the state governments, or deriving its or it's born out of statutory provisions of the Parliament of India or the legislatures of the state, then we must see the sort of function it discharges. If it discharges public function, then yes, very well, it can be treated as a state body. But if it discharges commercial functions, private interest, then it might not be that possible to include it under the shelter of state body. Now, the second criteria that we go into is if it acts as an agent or instrumentality of the government or not. First of all, yes, it discharges public function, but can it be treated as an agent or instrumentality of the government in certain aspect? Because what is the role of the government? The government being the welfare state, its role is to create policies, laws in the interest of the citizens of India. Now, for that, we have the right to education, again, one of your fundamental rights. So, if education is your fundamental right, and if a private university being in the public domain is exercising that right, or imparting that right to, let's say, not all the citizens, but those citizens who can afford to study in the private university in a way. So yes, we can very well say that the function of the private universities fall in the public domain, and in a way they are discharging the state welfare functions, because impartment of education is a function of the welfare state, the government of India. So this, to an extent, if we extend the interpretation of the welfare state to the private universities, we can say that those universities can be taken under the shelter of Article 12. And then the question comes whether or not unequal treatment or any discrimination by private universities can be taken to the court as a violation of your fundamental rights or not. So the case I am deriving all this interpretation is of Janet Jaipal versus SRM University. So, the facts of this case are very, very, very simple. What happened in this case was that here the petitioner, who was an employee, who was a professor in the SRM University, she actually invoked the writ jurisdiction under High Court of Madras. So now when we talk about writ jurisdiction, two provisions are triggered. First of all, Article 32 for the Supreme Court, Article 226 for the High Court. Under Article 226, she approached the High Court of Madras because she was terminated from her services. What happened that it was alleged of her that she failed to conduct 2 classes, which she said on a response that she did take those classes, but it was alleged that she was not present, or she did not take 2 classes when she was supposed to be there taking the classes. And despite her response, despite she denying the allegations, she was terminated out of the employment. And which is why then she filed a writ petition for the enforcement of fundamental rights in the High Court, saying that the body, university, is a state body, and which is why the termination of her employment is violation of her fundamental rights. Now, the High Court had to decide whether or not, first of all, the private universities can be treated as a state body or not, within the meaning of Article 12. So there was an amicus curiae which was appointed by the court, and the Constitution of India, in the first instance, is to examine what is the object and the purpose of the organization for which it is created. So we have discussed that imparting education is a public duty, it is a public function. However, the High Court was of the opinion that because the university is a private university, it would not fall under Article 12, and rejected her claim. Then the case went on before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court did consider other aspects through which the private universities are created. So the Supreme Court was of the opinion that the SRM University is a juristic body which is engaged in imparting education, higher education, and is conferred the status of deemed university by the central government under Section 3 of the University Grants Commission Act of 1956. So, the UGC provisions that we have to abide by. So, under Section 3 of the same Act, it is given the recognition as a deemed university and imparting education to students at large. And therefore, it is a public function, and is the activity of imparting education to the students at large, irrespective of the status of any such body. It should be made amenable to the jurisdiction of the High Court. Now here, even if we say that the Supreme Court even extended the purview under other authority by including private universities as a state body, but in a way it is restricted to be approachable only under the jurisdiction of the High Court and not the Supreme Court. But this is a step ahead. This is a recent case law of 2015 I'm talking about. So from this perspective, even if private authorities or private universities are treated as authorities for the purposes of law, they are not per se treated as state bodies. So now you can approach for any violation of your fundamental rights in the High Court, talking about the jurisdiction of the High Court. Now, when I say or when I mention about the writ jurisdiction, 32 and 226 may definitely look very similar in their wordings or powers, but there is a minor difference, or I would say the difference is not minor, but a major. Can somebody tell me if they are aware of what is the difference between 32 and 226? When you can and when you cannot approach the Supreme Court or the High Court. Yes, Sagar?
Ma'am, Article 32, that is the writ jurisdiction of Supreme Court, can only be taken when the fundamental right under Part 3 of the Constitution is violated, whereas the High Court has a wider jurisdiction. Its writ jurisdiction can also be asked for when any of the legal right is also violated in addition to fundamental.
Absolutely. And one more important aspect you are missing out. Can you think of it? Under special extraordinary circumstances, which right is available to you? So I am talking about in the time of emergency. So you must be aware that all your fundamental rights are suspended during the time of emergency. Only Article 20 and 21 are extended. So this means that Article 32, that is also a part of your fundamental rights. So to approach the Supreme Court for the violation of your fundamental rights is one of your fundamental rights in a way. However, your right to approach the High Court for the violation of fundamental rights as well as any legal rights is not accorded as the status of your fundamental rights, because it does not constitute, or it is not brought under Part 3 of the Constitution, whereas Article 32 is again your fundamental right against constitutional remedy. And also that right remains suspended during the time of emergency. So even if you want to approach the Supreme Court for the violation of 20 and 21, you cannot do so. You can only do so before a High Court under Article 226. So this is in essence, a major differentiation between these two rights, these two constitutional remedy, or I would say writ jurisdiction. This discussion might, seem a bit off track, but as I have said again, previously I'm saying this again, that your rights or your part or the provisions of the fundamental rights or the Constitution are not read in isolation. There are always other aspects to it which are, affected and which you should be aware of. And only then you can make a concrete case while being aware of all the relevant or the prevalent circumstances. So now coming back to the discussion of equality, we've learned that why it is essential to even understand what constitutes a state body. So here we've discussed that what all constitutes as a state body. But can anybody tell me or come up with an example which is not a state body? The judicial bodies, administrative bodies to an extent, or even the private universities now are taken under the shelter of other authorities under Article 12. So what is left? Is there anything left which does not constitute a state body against whom you cannot enforce your fundamental rights? Any example, anything comes in your mind? We've been talking about, public functions so far. United Nations. Okay. So, all right. For that, United Nations clearly does not constitute a state body because we are talking about only those bodies who are created by the provisions of law of India. And United Nations is an independent organization, international body, I would say. And United Nations is actually created for the enforcement or the protection of your fundamental rights. So we are here talking only about those bodies through which the government of India or the territory of India have an exercise. So the question about international bodies or international companies will not come into the being at all in this reference. Private companies of India, yes, private companies of India can very well are excluded out of the purview. Now talking about the functions, we were talking about public functions. Now, if the government of India is involved into the trade and commerce or, involved into import and export, so all these functions are not public. They do not constitute the state welfare functions. They are commercial functions discharged by the government of India. Then can those bodies still be taken as a state body or not? The corporations, which are, the subsidiaries of or the investment of government of India in a certain company for the discharging commercial functions for gaining profit, earning profit, involving into trade and commerce. Can those bodies also be treated as a state body? First of all, can government of India involve itself in the trade and commerce? Government of India exercise commercial functions? They are also extended the definition of Article 12. Those state bodies exercising commercial functions, can they be treated as a state body? Article 12. Can their employees, so let's say, can the employees of those bodies approach the court for the violation of their fundamental rights? That's what I intend to ask. Government of India has set up a new company for import and export of goods, and there are employees who are working in that company, and there is an issue with respect to promotion, let's say. So that triggers Article 14, Article 16. 16 talks about equality in terms of public employment. Can those employees approach the court for violation of 14 and 16? That corporation is not discharging any public function. It discharges commercial function, despite it is owned by the government of India or any state body. Decide upon those facts on the basis of its merit because they are assumed to be a state body. Yes, they can very well do so. So what matters is the essential aspect is whether or not there is direct or indirect control by the government of India or any state government of India. If that can clearly be proved, then there is no further test required. The test of other authorities is only required when it is not clarified or there is no certainty from the perspective whether or not the government has any control whatsoever or not. Where there is a direct proof or direct evidence as to a government control, then you don't need to go into further tests. So despite the fact that it discharges commercial function, but if it is owned and controlled by the government of India, wholly or partly, it will be treated as a state body. Are we clear on this aspect? What constitutes a state body? If yes, please let me know in the chat box. If not, ask questions. There can be only two possible scenarios. Either you got the point, either you didn't get the point.
So, ma'am, the case you which the illustration which you just gave, the employees of that state-owned enterprise can approach the court under article for violation of Article 14, right? Okay, yes.
So now I want to ask is, do you think the Board of Control for Cricket in India is a state body? So in the light of, discussion that we've had, can BCCI state body? What do you think?
No, ma'am, it is not a state.
What was held? I want to know, what do you think? Even if you agree with the rationale of the court, I want to know why do you think that it cannot be a state body, and why you think that it should be a state body? Because I'm talking about, this particular case in which it is already held that BCCI will not come under the purview of Article 12. So this was the Telefilms case. But I really want to know the rationale, because first of all, I personally don't agree with the court had decided, because sort of, functions it discharges, the way it is constituted, the way the government has exercised and control over BCCI. BCCI should very well be, taken under the purview of Article 12. I want to know, what do you think, whether or not BCCI is a public body or not? What BCCI does, how it is constituted, under what law it is created, is it a statutory body, non-statutory body? You can Google. I'm giving you like 2-3 minutes to, do a bit of research. And then I want to hear from few of you. I will be very happy if you volunteer, because I am not that authoritarian sort of personality where I'll ask mandatorily students to, speak up, and I'll call out names and bombard them if they don't. No, I really like those who participate and who really want to know and get an insight into all these discussions. So take 2-3 minutes. It's 13:56. Click 4 minutes. Be back by 2. Come up with an answer and let me know, what do you think about BCCI. I would really appreciate if you engage in the discussion and we can have, sort of very interactive session. Yes, it should be a state body. Zeel, again, what is your rationale? Why do you think so? I am more interested in your reasoning rather than your answers.
Okay, so why I think that it should be because BCRA has been playing Monopoly ever since it was formed, and after it was registered as a charitable society under the Act, it has received a substantial funding in the form of tax exemptions and land grants. Also, the board has exempted a lot of tax in previous years, and so I believe that BCCI should be considered as state under Article 24. And it has all the Supreme Court has already considered it as a public authority under the RTI, though BCCI has itself not claimed for it, but like
Right.
stated it
Yes,
officially.
of course. Definitely. Even if the court decided otherwise, I also feel that BCCI should be extended the status of being a state body, because not only it, is in the public domain, because cricket is considered to be like one of the greatest sports of India, and the cricketers who go out to the other countries, play different tournaments, represent India in a way. So nowhere from far fetch it is a private body discharging private function, because the government of India also has the power to decide whether or not the cricketers will go out in other countries or not. They can very well deny the cricketers to represent India in a certain tournament. This happened, I can't recollect exactly in which year, but the government of India denied the representation for a particular season that was to be happen in Pakistan. And talking about BCCI is the only body, I would say, who manages the organization of the cricket tournaments across the country. And also talking about the statutory provision. So BCCI is created through the Tamil Nadu Societies Registration Act. So it derives its recognition out of the Tamil Nadu Society Registration Act. So considering all these aspects, even the court was of the opinion that BCCI should be treated as a state body. But do you know what is the main reason why BCCI was not accorded uh, uh, the definition of state under Article 12? Did anyone look up that? What was the rationale of the court for deciding otherwise? Anyone? If you don't know, you can say no. Then I'll continue with explaining why it did so.
I came across a case where it was said that BCCI is not created by statute and it is not dominated by government in the financially, functionally, or administratively.
Tarini, I can't hear you. There's a lot of disturbance in your background, maybe. I can't hear you clearly. I mean, I just can't listen to what you are saying. I'm sorry, maybe you can post it in the chat box. What do you think? If that works for you. So yes, I was saying that the main essential reason behind not according BCCI as a state body to not open the floodgate of litigations. So, just like BCCI who manages and handles the sports of cricket, there are a lot many other sports which are played in India, and there are a lot many other such organization or potentially in future that might be there. So for those sake, if BCCI is accorded the state definition, then the similar recognition must also be given to those bodies who manage and control other sports in India, and which will, in a way, open the floodgate of litigations for the courts, and the courts do not want to have that burden on themselves to hear many litigations coming across the country, or the high courts going to the high courts of the concerned state for that matter. So this is in a sense the primary reason that they were hesitant to extend the other authority definition to BCCI. REV says BCCI is not created by a statute, not dominated by government either financially, functionally, or administratively, hence cannot be called a state. All right, to an extent, yes, but for the reasons that I have given, I feel that the decisions of deciding whether or not the cricketers would uh, represent India in other countries is absolutely up to the central government to decide. Sagar says, because it is not created by any statute. Sagar, we just discussed that BCCI is created by Tamil Nadu Registration Societies Act. No government intervention during the time of does not satisfy necessities laid down. Airport authority case. Okay, might not be so. Don't you confuse with the tests which are delivered through a judicial pronouncement. One of the most important cases from the perspective of the deciding test is Ajay Hasia's case. But again, be it Ajay Hasia's case or any other case from any other perspective, whatever guidelines or the list given by the courts, they are not exhaustive. They are inclusive and indicative in nature. It does not mean that every other authority has to fulfill all criteria which are laid down by the judicial pronouncement in a particular case. The court time and again tries to, guide or give some sort of knowledge or guidance upon based upon a particular facts and circumstances of the case. But if you look at Ajay Hasia's case, if you look at international authorities case, airport authority case, then also all the criteria are not exhaustive in its nature. They are just indicative and they are at the same time inclusive as well. So you can add as many aspects as you feel like as you go ahead with the coming cases at your hand. So again, it is all about interpretation. I'm not saying my interpretation is right because, of course, the court had to decide otherwise. So, of course, what the court has decided, it is the rationale or it is the interpretation which must be adopted. But, we have the right to critique what the courts had to say, not in the present time because the current democracy is not democratic per se, but that would be altogether another discussion we'll be going into. But the spirit of democracy says that we are open or we are, we can very well criticize judicial pronouncements and we can very well give our opinion on what do we think the courts should have done or the government should have done for that matter. But in applicability, it does not work like that. So yes, you can freely have your opinion. You can very well, agree with or have consonance with what the courts had to say. You can very well have your individual opinion at the same time. But what should happen is you at least have some clarity as to decide what bodies are a state body under Article 12, because that's the important and the first step towards enforcing your fundamental rights. Now, coming back to the discussions of Article 14, two important points I wanted to discuss. It says equality before law and equal protection of law. Is there any difference at all between these two terms? What does equality before law and equal protection of laws differ in their meaning? How they are different, if at all they are, and if there is no difference whatsoever, then why we have two individual terms, two different terms in the same article? Short, what does equality before law mean? You are mute if you are speaking.
Okay, sorry. Equality before law means that no one is above the law of the land, and it could have a negative connotation, but it means that law does not discriminate on the basis of birth, position, gender, or any other attributes. Thus, privileged, unprivileged, and everyone is equal before the law. While equal protection of law means that law provides equal opportunities to all those who are in a similar circumstance or situation.
Yes, absolutely. So two important points, indicated by Z. So first of all, equality before law is a negative connotation, is a negative phrase or attached a bit of negative meaning to it. So how do you say that equality before law is a negative connotation? Because it, in a way, restricts the government from not according special privilege to different people or different class of people. So grammatically also, if you say that, how do you determine whether or not a particular sentence is negatively formed or not? So in a way, you don't tell somebody to do something, rather you ask them not to do something. This is when you feel, or this is when you recognize that there is a negative meaning attached to the meaning of equality before law. So as we have, understood what equality before law means, even though it is negative, it restricts the government from not treating other people specially. So let's say we as a citizen of India have been given all the same fundamental rights. Can we say that certain group of people have different fundamental rights than others? No. Everybody is treated the same in the eyes of law. Can you say that your right to be sued or right to prosecute or be prosecuted is different than those of others who are again the citizens of India? No, you cannot say that, because we have equality before law. Everybody is treated equally. Is there any bifurcation whatsoever about your voting rights? Is anybody discriminated on the basis of, whatever gender or race or wealth or societal status, that only those people who earn beyond 5 lakh are eligible to vote in the general elections? Is there any sort of limitation this way? No, of course not. Is there any restriction for report of a crime? Can the government authorities or public officials say that or claim the exception of being the public officers, or can they discharge themselves out of the responsibility arising out of any criminal or civil violation? Can they use the public powers or the public authority? No, even if they are the public body, public authority, but they are also the citizens of India. So they only have to exercise their powers as prescribed by law. So now the rule of law, the notion of rule of law, what does rule of law mean? That law is above everybody. I mean, of course, there are certain exceptions to the rule of law as well, because the governor and the president enjoy some sort of immunity from the criminal proceedings. We have discharge of fundamental rights during the time of emergency. Diplomats and the ambassadors are also immune from the jurisdiction of the local or the Indian courts. Special treatment for the army personnel, you know, martial law is there, martial courts for them, and also for the medical practitioners, they are treated differently. So these are the exceptions to the rule of law, I would say. Talking about normal circumstances, can the police officer refuse to take up your FIR because he doesn't like you, or because of whatsoever the reason could be? Can he do that? Let's not go into practicality of what happens. Let's go by theory, that what is the intention or the spirit of the Constitution about equality before law. So of course he cannot do so. He has to take your FIR irrespective of whatever his personal agendas or opinions are. So this notion talks about equality before law. Now, coming back to equal protection of laws, Zeel has again correctly mentioned that alike should be treated alike. But those who are not similarly placed should not be treated alike. So for inequality to exist, even if you treat those who are not similarly placed equally, then also there is a violation of right to equality. Because what equal protection of law provides that you should only treat equals who are placed in equal circumstances. Now, what do we mean by equals and equal circumstances? That rule of law is absolute in its nature? No. Do we not have any special provisions for scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, women, or children for that matter, juveniles in the criminal law? Then don't you think so? All the special provisions or affirmative actions, I would say reservations also in a way, violation does not they violate your right to equality? Why you are not given special place in an academic institution or not admitted at a lower marks or a lower percentage with a lower fees? Why only a certain class or group of people are eligible to that? Don't you think about all these questions and how unequal or unfair it might be? And if it is such, then why the government still has those provisions in force? Why they are not struck down, being unconstitutional? Reservations even in public employment, reservations for the academic admissions in schools, colleges, which are even private run. Forget about state, that is understood. But to an extent in private institutions also we have some sort of reservation. Behind those aspects then. What do you think could be the reason that the government of India has all these provisions in place? Violate the right to equality of others who are not given the special sort of treatment? Don't you think so? Can you claim concession or reservation in the public employment if you have scored a little less, which the person from other group can very well take up that opportunity at a lower mark, but you are not accorded the same? It violates your right to equality. Then what do you think is the justification behind these type of actions, these type of policies or laws? Have the Prevention of Atrocities Against the Scheduled Caste, Scheduled Tribe Act. Yet, or has just logged in about your presence, man. Let me know you're at least there. Chat box, I really need to confirm who all are there.
I'm here, Krishan.
Oh, ma'am, I wasn't talking about you. All right. I think I'll just continue. So the hints that I was trying to give. So we have one comment. So yeah, Zeel, thank you so much for being constantly interactive participant. Apply the rule of equal protection of law, they are considered to be a separate group of people. Excellent. So now this leads to another question. How do we determine that a group of people having notified or having a different meaning than others is a legit group or not? How do we differentiate between two groups? What is the rationale behind looking at or classifying two classes differently so that any of their fundamental rights are not violated? So again, Article 14 comes into being. What Article 14 essentially prescribes is that it, first of all, does not allow class legislation, but it allows classification. Now, again, these are very confusing terms, looking very similar, but having altogether different meanings attached to them. Class legislation becomes when you create laws for a certain group of people, but they are not picked reasonably. There are left out people who might be having similar sort of circumstances, but they are not included in that group. But classification is more of a tangible aspects. For that, there is a test that needs to be determined on the basis of which we say that the classification is a reasonable one. And we have two developed tests. So first of all, the old doctrine, we say that the test of reasonable classification. If you want to create special laws for, let's say, socially and educationally backward group of people, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, women, children, juvenile, then you prove that those class or group of people fulfill the test of reasonable classification. What do we exactly mean by the test of reasonable classification? It means that first of all, there has to be an intelligible differentia, and secondly, there has to be rational nexus. What do we mean by intelligible differentia? Intelligible differentia means that is something which can be seen, on the surface of it. You don't have to go and dig deeper to understand how these two groups are different. And rational nexus, there has to be a reason behind which, based on the intelligible differentia, you are creating a different, distinct group to be accorded privilege differently from the other people. Now, when we talk about women or the other sort of examples that we have been, putting on, there is a classification. And now, for that, we have to go again about the history of India, the Hindu caste system, and the years of oppression and inequalities that were in existence. Now, whereabout? So when the constitution was created, those types of classification which were prevalent and which were running years and years of inequalities and oppression were in existence there. If you must know, we had Manusmriti, where it is to be treated as the most authoritative book on the Hindu law, and from where all our personal laws are derived. Let's not go into the personal laws because that will trigger another complicated discussion. So talking about the Indian caste system, we had Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, Shudras, and Dalits, the untouchables, the outcasts that, Dalits were not even considered as a caste during those times. And the Brahmins and Kshatriyas who treated themselves as so-called upper class people. They did not allow the Vaishyas or Shudras or Dalits to, access certain special or, even public places. They could not even touch them. They could not even use the wells, public places. They cannot even enter into temples. Forget about marrying into that class. But even the professions were bifurcated according to their caste. And during those times, we did not have fundamental rights. We did not treat everybody equally. But it was only when we were adopting the constitution, one of the very prominent Dalit member of the Constituent Assembly and the chairman as well, Baba Sahib Ambedkar, who was Dalit himself. And everybody from the Constituent Assembly agreed that there should be elimination of all sorts of discrimination. But how do you bring equal stance, or how do you bring them at the parallels of those who were treated specially back then? So it is only through the form of substantive equality. Now, when we talk about equal protection of laws, there is also another concept called formal and substantive equality. And very beautifully, the Supreme Court, in one of the cases, P.K. Pavitra versus Union of India, has said that, for equality to be truly effective or substantive, I would say, the principle is that we must recognize the existing inequalities, that there are certain inequalities which are existing in the society. First of all, we need to accept that notion. Then only we can truly make equality effective. It says when we talk about reservations, so reservations are not the exception to the rule of law, but they are rather the fulfillment of effective and substantive equality by accounting for the structural conditions into which people are born. Now, even in terms of geography, or access to justice, or equal economic opportunities, or academic opportunities, or professional opportunities, we cannot say a student studying in a private university such as Oro and a student coming from the rural area competing in the same examination, for example, or taking up the same competitive exam and trying to get the same opportunity to be working in the public employment, are treated to be equally on the same paradigm. Because of the years of oppression and inequality and exploitation that existed, it makes them not equal to you. And for that, to be able to compete on the same paradigm, the first aspect is to firstly recognize that there exists the current inequality of opportunities and the treatment. And secondly, to compete on the same paradigm, it is also essential to bring those class at par with you. Then only you can say that you have achieved equality before law. So then only you can treat this and these groups equally. Because equal protection of law is a very progressive concept, very practical concept, I would say. But equality before law, even though negative, but it is a sort of notion, a spirit, or a theory that we are trying to create, that there exists equal society where everybody is put in the same footing. And there, once we have say that everybody is equal in the eyes of law and everybody is accorded the same treatment, meaning to say nobody is treated differently. And there exists no special treatment or no special law or legislation for that matter, once we have attained equality before law. So in essence, what we are trying to do is With the help of equal protection of law, we are trying to achieve equality before law. And until we do so, until we achieve equality before law, we are going to need help of equal protection of law to be able to come there, to be able to reach there. And that's how, in the absence of equality before law, we maintain the balance in the society with the help of equal protection of law. Was that too heavy for you? I mean, could you relate, understand? Questions? If one is to read concentration of independence, the idea of equality, equity and equality had seemingly taken a center stage, one cannot help but wonder discrimination laws cannot apply to private entities as well as business. Doesn't indicate the purpose of fostering the idea of cultural integration. That's very comprehensive legislative justified. Our main argument is about applying the same principles to private entities or private individuals or private businesses, but that would not defeat the spirit of the Constitution, I would say. But the spirit of Constitution says that it is the responsibility of the state to act towards the welfare of their citizens and not individual citizen or private citizens, I would say. And which is why we have Part 4 of the Constitution, which talks about directive principles of state policy. So it is the responsibility of the state, being the welfare nation, to bring about all these changes in the society. And it is not the responsibility of you as an individual or me as a private individual or any private entity created by either of us or both of us or many like us to fulfill the public obligations, discharge public functions, and work as a welfare state. And which is why there are certain exceptions even on your fundamental rights. So, the state can take up any measure it want or it feel like to fulfill its directive principles of state policy under Part 4 of the Constitution. And for that matter, even if it takes away your fundamental rights under Article 14 or 19, you cannot challenge those laws before court of law. To give that effect, we have Schedule 9. If you look at Schedule 9, whichever laws are placed under Schedule 9, you cannot challenge them in the court of law. And for all these to be discussed, there is another topic which talks about the basic structure of the Constitution. But in essence, Amar, talking about your issue, let's say, what if the government decides to accord or, push all these obligations or responsibilities on the private businesses? Then why do the government needs to take or collect taxes from us? Why do we have elections if everybody or every citizen for that matter is working in the capacity of, the state welfare function? Then why do we need or why do we even give special privileges to those who are the member of the parliament or who's the governor, who's the president? Why they get certain immunity, extra powers, and we do not? Basically impossible for the entire country to, uh, discharge public functions and run in a way, and which is why we, through the parliamentary form of government, have set up elections and we elect those candidates who we entrust that will take decisions in our best interest. Yes, Amal, I would really like you to speak up.
Yeah, and I think the question was a little misleading on my behalf. What I meant to say was, I did not mean that we should delegate the public function of the role of law and order to private businesses. However, my point was that usually what I have, from whatever I have read, uh, usually anti-discrimination laws are not really applicable on the private businesses, as we have also discussed earlier. What my contention with this is, unlike United States, like, again, United States is no torchbearer of equality, but even then there are some anti-discrimination laws, in place put in place by the Congress, that you know uh, fulfill the function. Fulfill the function of ensuring that there is some equality, and there are no biased means of rejecting or disregarding someone's work. Uh, so but there is a complete lack of that in India, or rather, the ones which are also there, they are not very comprehensive, and are often criticized by the contemporary academia, that they are not very functional at fulfilling their duties. So I just wanted to know your opinion, if whether there is a need of proper anti-discrimination law that applies to the private sector.
Sir, I think in essence, you're trying to talk about the horizontal application of fundamental rights. So, the application of fundamental rights happens two ways. First of all, it is vertically, which goes from the structure of the state towards its citizen, and vice versa. Here, you're talking about the horizontal application, which derives from its own meaning, what horizontal means. Applicability of your fundamental rights and enforceability against the private entities or private individuals. So it's not that all the laws are only enforceable against the state body. So I again said majority of the laws have their enforceability only against the state body, or it is the responsibility of the state body. But there are certain provisions which are applied horizontally as well. So, such as Article 15, Clause 2, that talks about not allowing any people or a group of person to enter into public sphere, public places, and certain examples are accorded there. Article 21, Article 17, untouchability in abolishment of titles, right to education, extending the features above to the private universities. So these are certain provisions which talk about horizontal application of fundamental rights. But it is not prevalent in India that your fundamental rights are widely applied horizontally. Part, it is still assumed that it is the responsibility of the state as the welfare state. The notion of being a welfare state, it is upon the state to not discriminate, to treat everybody equally. But as I mentioned, certain provisions in the fundamental rights itself, which have their application horizontally and not just vertically. I could clarify your question.
Yes, it did. Thank you so much.
Yeah, all right. So I'll be more than happy to take up any questions we have so that we can, I mean, we've already exceeded time that was prescribed, but yeah, I'll be more than happy to take any questions or any, queries any of you might have. Thank you so much for being such a great audience and hearing me out.
Thank you, Kusha, for taking this lecture. It feels so amazing, overwhelmed, delighted to see you here delivering a lecture. I was like a couple of days back, I was just remembering your class and know how we used to have a lot of fun and there was a lot of masti, and now you have become a professor in a university, addressing your juniors. So it is such an amazing feeling to have you here. So thank you, Krusha, for coming and delivering this talk.
Krusha,
It's my honor. Yes, I'm go on.
yeah. Krusha, there is a saying in the northern part of India that Guru Gud रह जाता है, चेला शक्कर हो जाता है. Shakkar is an improvised version of good. So,
Bye.
after hearing you, I think the same thing is implied here. That you mentioned at the beginning of your lecture that I was the faculty who taught you Constitution. But then
Yes.
after this lecture, I can say that that Kahawat sits here. Now, I may be good, but you have become Shakkar.
And what can I say? I'm honored to even, accept this compliment. I am so honored. I cannot express enough gratitude in the first place for, being called as a lecturer here to talk to my juniors. Some of them are familiar to me, some of them I don't recognize. But I'll be always there for whosoever needs me. That's all I can say. And I really feel honored to be on this platform. Seriously.
So, over to Vrishti ma'am now.
Yes, ma'am, I have said what I wanted. I just want to reaffirm and tell you that we are never going to leave you. We are going to call you again and again here. So you were and you are a part of our university. So whenever you'll have time, we'll definitely call you again to have a talk with your juniors.
Definitely.
Right? Thank you so much.
I'll be more than happy. Yes.
Thank you, Krusha, and all the best for
Thank
all your future endeavors. See you.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.
Good again. Once again, a good afternoon to everyone. I'm Zeelan. I'm here to present the vote of thanks to our today's master lecturer for masterclass. I would like to thank our guest lecturer, Ms. Krusha Bhatt, for enlightening us with their knowledge. Today's masterclass was full of knowledge and interesting things. It gave us deep insights into the topic and also revealed some interesting facts. The point where you told us about the relation between state and constitution and the relevance of article 14 to article 18 in relation to article 12, and also you enlightened us with the facts regarding right to equality. It was really informative. I am pretty sure that the precious knowledge that you gave us will definitely help us in our studies and future. Once again, I would like to thank you for taking out time from your busy schedule and enlightening us with your knowledge. Thank you so much. And I would also like to thank our head of department, Dr. Shilpi Sharma, for granting us the permission to organize these master classes and inviting you to conduct this session. I want to thank Dr. Vrishti Patel for guiding us and supporting us to make this event successful. I would also thank the co-coordinator, Dharini, and the student committee of LSED for their support. Also, thank you to all the students and other members present here for paying your attention and learning. Thank you.
You're most welcome, Zee, and thank you so much for constantly being in touch with me and coordinating everything. I might be a little laid back because I might not, I know I couldn't respond fully on time, but yeah, that's because of the other commitments I also have to adhere to. And thank you so much again, Shilpi ma'am, Vrishti ma'am, and the organizing team, the volunteers, and all the students who came to the class, I would say, and I had a great time discussing right to equality, Indian Constitution. Yeah, that's all from my end.
Thank you, Krusha. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining.